It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, even virtually. It's a sign of our times, I think, that we cannot meet in person. And I do regret not being able to be part of what I know is going to be a really exciting, stimulating conference. You couldn't have a more important time to talk about the issue of social policy in Africa. And so I'm happy to be even a small part of this, even indirectly in this manner. I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you my slides. So my topic is really about the whole issue of social policy in what is now an increasingly unequal world. And I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the aspects of that inequality and what that means in turn for social policy and for a subset of social policy, which is social protection. I think we need a bit of background. We need to establish that well before the global pandemic, and that's important for us to recognize, well before the global pandemic, in fact, capitalism was not in good shape. Okay? Capitalism was already showing slowing growth, decelerating investment. Overall, it was just less dynamic. And this has been true for a while, and particularly after the global financial crisis. Supposedly, the global economy recovered, but it really required unprecedented, historically unbelievable levels of liquidity injection by the central banks of advanced economies. Of course, the United States Federal Reserve was the head of the pack, but across the world, the advanced economies really did what would have been unimaginable even a decade earlier in terms of providing massive liquidity just to keep capitalism going, if you like. This, of course, many naysayers said this is going to lead to tremendous inflation. It did not. But the more important point for us is that it actually required this just to keep going at the rather limping speed that it had been. Now, why is this? A significant part of this is really because of the way in which capitalism had actually generated its own difficulties. It reflected underconsumption, the fact that globally demand was inadequate. There was lack of effective demand. And this is really because there was growing income inequality, growing asset inequality, falling wage shares, dramatically increasing profit shares in national incomes, and within the profit shares, massively increased shares of a few large, globally dominant multinational corporations. So this really meant that the majority of the global population had less opportunities and possibilities of spending, which in turn generated inadequate demand and then created less incentives to invest. So in a version of what you could call the classic prey-predator syndrome, capitalism was probably too successful for its own good, by which I mean that it kind of had undermined all of the elements which had kept it in check and thereby enabled it to actually do some dynamism. Neoliberalism, broadly speaking, undermined all of the checks and balance and limits to what became global capital's unfettered power. So, for example, the regulatory power of states, the ability to regulate labor markets, capital markets, financial markets, environmental markets was dramatically undermined and reduced. The power of workers, we all know, the bargaining power of workers diminished dramatically. And this was assisted also by legal changes that made it harder and harder for workers to associate and mobilize. And of course, global welfare, state welfare, the welfare state more or less disappeared. And this was in most parts of the world, not everywhere. And this, of course, is also expressed in terms of social policy or the decline of significant social policy in many parts of the world. So let's just look at what happened to global GDP growth over this longish period. You look at the past half century and you find that, yes, GDP has been going up, but the rate of growth has been almost continuously decelerating over the entire period. And so, here it is, neoliberalism is supposed to give you unfettered capital. There's nothing stopping capital from doing exactly what it's like, what it wants. And of course, the nature of capital is to accumulate, to grow and grow and grow. My friend, the journalist P. Sainath, has described it as the ideology of the cancer cell, that you just have to keep growing, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets. Yet that impetus was coming down. And this is really reflective of what I was saying, that it had undermined all the elements that provided some countervailing force that enabled it actually to grow. And because of that, global investment has been highly volatile. Now, it looks as if in one of the decades in the 2000s decade that investment went up, but I'm going to explain how that really reflects only one region. It reflects the East Asian region. Overall, you find that investment really didn't grow much. It was very, very volatile, and it was not showing significant growth, despite the fact that capitalism had basically, beaten all its rivals, destroyed all opposition. You would have thought that this is the moment then to actually invest more. But no, you find that that doesn't happen. And that's particularly evident if you look at what's been happening in the regions that are the home, if you like, the core of global capitalism. So in this chart, the green line is global investment, but you can see how that is utterly dominated by China. Look how the major economies, it's really China that is showing the big dynamism in investment. The other economies, it's really flat from the 1990s onwards. And it's really China and therefore East Asia that has dominated in global investment. And of course, China, as we know, it's capitalism, sure, but it's a whole different animal from what we see in the advanced world. And it is very state-led, very state-directed. So it's not quite the same as allowing unfettered capitalism. What's even more interesting is that within this expansion of investment, private investment has really not grown at all. Look at the shares of private capital in total fixed capital investment. And in the northern countries, in the USA, you find it's been flat and falling over the recent period. It's increasing in China, yes. And what is also interesting is that the share of private capital in total investment is higher in China than in the US. Supposedly, the state socialist, Chinese model has actually got a larger share of private investment than the US. But that's a topic for another day. It's just worth remembering this. The basic point is that there has actually been not much investment dynamism in this dramatic period of the, shall we say, flowering, the unfettered, deregulated flowering of global capital. Now, of course, then the pandemic made things infinitely worse. And there are so many reasons and factors for how the pandemic made things worse. But here's just the latest indicator in terms of the overall change in economic activity. Big falls in 2020. It appears from this, 2020, as you can see, the advanced world actually did worse in terms of the proportionate decline. Yes, apparently. Emerging economies did badly, but not quite as bad overall. That, again, largely because of China. China is the exception to most of the developing world. If I had done this without China, I would have got a very different figure, closer to the advanced economies' decline. And the rebound in 2021 is also essentially because of China. But what's worth looking at is the low-income countries, the developed countries that are not the emerging market and middle-income countries, and that's the green bar. And as you can see, the recovery there has been minimal, has been much, much lower. The rebound hasn't really occurred in the same way. So why this divergence between the rich countries and the developing world, and particularly the low-income world? One of them is going to be no surprise, especially in Africa. It's vaccine apartheid, the inequality in vaccine distribution. And this graph, this map captures the number of vaccine doses administered for 100 people. And as you can see, it's really a north-south divide, once again, with the exception of China, which has got a very high rate of vaccination, and Chile, which largely used Chinese vaccines in its own vaccination drive. But in much of the developing world, in fact, it's much, much lower than the rate in the US and in Europe and in Australia, the advanced countries generally. Africa, as you can see, the rates are abysmal. I mean, there are some countries, large parts of the African region have got vaccination rates of less than 5% even today. You will find that this number exceeds 100 for many countries. And that's not only because many vaccines require more than one dose, but because of boosters. And that's another story which is worth being told. So, it's obvious, this vaccine apartheid, it's vaccine production and distribution have become a really stark sign of inequality during the pandemic. Of course, there was the vaccine grab by rich countries, which I think everybody is familiar with, that the minute that some vaccines got approval from the US Food and Drug Administration or from other developed country regulatory authorities, there was a mad scramble to order as many of these vaccines as possible. So even though there was a global facility to enable the equitable distribution of vaccines, that is COVAX, the countries that were members of COVAX, the rich countries, all did side deals with vaccine companies. So they grabbed. Within 2 weeks, they had grabbed 85% of the production for the whole year for AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna, the three big vaccine that got approval early. So there was vaccine grab. But then what is worse is that then, because these pharma companies had been given the intellectual property rights, the patents, by rich country governments, and then these country governments insisted on maintaining those IPR rights, other countries could not enable their producers to make these. There was no technology sharing, even though they could have made these companies share their vaccine knowledge, simply because it had all been done with public research and public financing. All of these vaccines were prepared 90% with the background of public research and then with massive subsidies that were provided to companies to develop these vaccines. Yet, these companies were then allowed to retain the patent rights, which meant that they restricted the production by limiting it only to themselves and to the few other companies that they signed up agreements with. So vaccine distribution, I mean, there was both nationalism, which was very, very evident in it, but also this whole diplomatic so-called soft power. So when alternative vaccines became available, the Chinese two vaccines, Sinopharm and Sinovac, for example, the US administration and the Europeans actually told countries in Latin America and Africa not to use them. They said, oh, these are not safe, they're not as effective, don't go there, don't take them. So what were they saying? They were saying, we will not give you vaccines. We will grab all the vaccines ourselves. We will not even let our companies share the knowledge that will enable you to make the vaccines. But then we don't like it when you go and try and buy vaccines from other sources as well. Now, this is, of course, ridiculous, because we all know that a pandemic can only be overcome when it's overcome everywhere. It should be a no-brainer. It is so obvious. It is public health 101. And yet these governments have behaved as if that reality doesn't exist. Now, in fact, what everybody said at the time, and which Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, repeatedly said, is that if you do not do this, if you delay vaccination of people across the world, the virus will mutate. And this will then affect economic prospects in both the developed and the developing countries. It's not that you can escape it simply by saying, I'm going to vaccinate my own population. And so you will get mutant varieties. And so we have Delta plus, which we know are more infectious, more deadly. And there is always the fear that a new mutant could be less controlled by the vaccines. So far, we've been relatively fortunate that the existing mutants are not so resistant to vaccines, but you never know. This is an ever-present threat. And it's because the rich world has been so selfish that they now have to go in for booster vaccines. And that, again, is another obscenity. Today, in a press conference, the WHO head, Dr. Tedros, mentioned that already there are more booster shots being delivered in rich countries than first vaccines in Africa. That's the kind of vaccine apartheid that we have, with, of course, the obvious implications then for economic recovery after the pandemic or livelihood recovery during the pandemic. But another big reason for this inequality that I have mentioned is because of the very different fiscal responses between developed and developing countries. So the first set of columns shows the fiscal response in advanced economies, the second set in the emerging market and middle income countries, and then finally the low income countries. So you can see that both in terms of actual spending and taxes foregone, which is the blue column, and in terms of all the other underwriting of borrowing by others, providing guarantees, providing loans, and so on, it's been a massive fiscal expansion in the developed world, much less in the middle income and emerging market countries, and very, very much less in the poorest countries. Now, these are all as a share of GDP. So in absolute numbers, the differences are even starker. Let me just give you one example of the starkness of the difference. The additional fiscal spending in the US alone since January 2020 is in the order of, depending on the measure, anywhere between $25,000 and $30,000 per capita. Per person, additional spending is between $25,000 and $30,000 per capita. The additional spending in the low-income countries, $2 per capita. That's the order of difference. $25,000, $2. That's the inequality that we are observing. So, as I said, between January 2020 and September 2021, advanced economies as a group have spent almost a quarter of their 2020 GDP, 23% of 2020 GDP on average. Okay, this is actually the biggest fiscal increase in capitalist economies outside wartime. It exceeds Roosevelt's New Deal spending in the Great Depression. It is unbelievable, the kind of spending that has occurred, especially in the US. And as a result of that, the IMF estimates that globally additional fiscal spending has come to almost $11 trillion. But 80% of that comes from just 10 advanced countries in the G20. 80%. Okay? The US alone accounts for almost half of this. Developing countries, by contrast, have spent less than they did in 2008-9 after the global financial crisis. They actually spent more as a share of their GDP in the aftermath of the global financial crisis than they're doing in this crisis, which is much bigger, which requires much more public spending, and which particularly requires spending on public health. So why is that? Why are developing countries spending so much less? Essentially, this is because of a combination of sovereign debt overhangs. Many countries have got massive debts which accrued over the pandemic. Some of them got moratoria, that is, they didn't have to pay the interest at the time, but it's all now accruing, and now they have to pay much more on interest than they did before because it's all come together. In fact, through the pandemic, about 80 countries were spending more on debt servicing than they were spending on health, even during this pandemic. And then, of course, the countries that are in deep distress and have to go to the IMF, you still find that austerity measures are still being imposed by the IMF. And so they still have to cut down on a whole range of spending, and they have to limit their aggregate spending even in this period of crisis. And then for the countries that don't have these problems, India, Mexico, a bunch of other countries, there is the fact that financial markets are always looking at your fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. And so these countries are very worried about credit downgrades and capital flight, just in case they actually increase their spending. So there are all these things that are limiting the additional spending of developing countries. And that in turn means that their recovery will necessarily be less, and that it will be necessarily lower and slower than that in the developed world. And that's made worse, or rather, it's partly a result, and then partly it's making things even worse, is the fact that employment declines are much bigger in the developing world. So the blue bars here are the advanced economies, the red bars are the developing world. And you can see that across all types of workers, whether the prime age workers or the young, and the employment declines of the young are truly terrifying in the developed.
Marius, have we lost Prof Ghosh's presentation?
Hi, I'm not sure what's going on, but I am here. So if you want, I could share the screen and do the presentation.
Yes, please proceed, Prof. Yes, please.
Okay, hold on. I'm not really sure what's happening. I'm just going to find the presentation on my laptop. Just
Thank you.
Yeah.
Whilst we are waiting for Prof Ghosh to settle in, colleagues, can we then try and put our questions on chat, on questions and answer session, and start thinking around the questions based on her presentation so that we can engage? Thank you. And colleagues, remember to tweet about the event and what's happening now.
Okay, if you will allow me to share my screen.
Marius, help us. Yes, thank you.
Okay, and let me just see where we were. Here, I think. Okay. Right, can you all hear me?
Yes, we Prof, can. You can proceed. Can. Yes, thank you.
And you can see the screen as well, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yes. Great. So as I was saying, the employment declines have actually been much bigger in the developing world. For the youth, just for this very short period, there's a 13% decline in employment in the developing world. But whether you're looking at young people or men and women or high skill, low skill, by every category, the decline in employment in developing countries has been anywhere between 3 times to, double to 4 or 5 times the decline in the developed world. And that's serious because we already had a lot of unemployment and underemployment, and we also have a youth bulge in many parts of the developing world. So that's a serious problem. And what's even worse is that we have a much greater degree of informality. So as you can see, globally, it's about 60% of the workers are informal, but that's really because of emerging and developing economies, where it is more like 70%. And as you can see, in developed countries, it's less than a quarter are informal in work. But there's a big difference across regions, as you can see. So Europe and Central Asia have the lowest rates of informality. Africa has the highest, but my own country, India, within Asia Pacific, has got very high rates of nearly 90% informal. And even in non-agriculture, a very, very high rate of informality in these countries. If you look at it globally, this is a map that is telling you pretty much the same thing. In terms of informal workers within, if you include agriculture and even if you exclude agriculture. And as you can see, when you include agriculture, then large parts of Africa and some parts of Asia, more than 3/4 of workers are informal. But even when you exclude agriculture, then you find that very large numbers, again, more than 3/4 are informal across South Asia, Central Asia, large parts of Africa, and even some parts of Latin America. Now, why is that important? Because, we've now seen in the pandemic that informal workers are so much more vulnerable. When you have declare a lockdown or when you cannot work anyway because of sickness or something, you have no legal protection at all. for job loss, from being made redundant, or from a reduction of your wages or working hours. The half of the informal that I've mentioned are self-employed workers. And so if you lose your ability to earn because there's been a lockdown or because there's been closures, there's no protection at all. There's no minimum wage, there are no furloughs, there's no compensation for the job loss or the income loss. And other than whatever happens to be provided by the state in terms of universal social protection, there's nothing, including health coverage. Now, remember, health coverage was absolutely critical during the pandemic. And yet we find that the majority of informal workers, especially in the developing world, really didn't get any of the basic health protection that they need. And there is no recognition as workers either. So most of the informal workers that I've been talking about also happen to live in the countries where governments haven't increased the public spending very much. So they're getting it both sides. Not only were they anyway denied legal and social protection, not only are there no automatic stabilizers that kick in when they will lose jobs or wages, but also these are the very same places where governments didn't actually increase their public spending in the ways that I have mentioned. And what's worse, they were also in the countries that had the most severe lockdowns. So if you look at the big, bright red circle on the extreme upper right-hand corner of the left graph, you will see India, which has this most severe lockdown in the world and the highest proportion of informality, and Pakistan, two countries which had very extreme lockdowns, and most of our workers are informal. And in general, you find that it's a very high proportion of informality was associated with more severe lockdowns, which obviously will make things much, much worse, as you can see. And the other aspect of this inadequate social protection and inadequate social policy is hunger. I think it's inadequately talked about. Certainly in the developed country discourse, it's not really mentioned enough. Now, the FAO had already estimated that between 80 to 132 million people would be additionally undernourished as a result of the pandemic. That is beyond the 840 million whom they had already described as being under severe threat of undernutrition. But then the pandemic has operated in ways that have made things worse, because not only the supply shortages in some countries and the balance of payments constraints that have affected food imports, but also the difficulties with the food supply chain, because lockdowns obviously affected harvesting, processing, transport of food items and delivery services. But the biggest increase in undernutrition has really been because of the decline in purchasing power. Vulnerable people have not been able to buy food, and that has been absolutely critical in adding to hunger. So the food insecurity that we're seeing now, it's not really only about supply constraints and so on. It's really about livelihood collapses. And that's driving the big increase in hunger that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic. Very recently, there's been a further increase in food inflation, as you can see. In fact, there's a lot of talk now, even in the US, about higher inflation rates. But a lot of this is driven by commodity price increases. And as you can see, the biggest increase, of course, is in energy prices. That's the purple line, which is going up. But even food is significantly higher. It's about 30% higher than it was a year ago, food prices. And that really matters for us. That's the one that matters in terms of how it affects our people directly, because these food prices, the increases get transmitted directly into poor countries, even when the price reductions don't necessarily get translated. And so, as you can see, from August 2020 onwards, there's been this increase in food prices. And then more recently, there's been an increase in beverage prices as well. Now, all this should make the need for universal social protection, the social protection floor that was talked about a few years ago with much enthusiasm, so obvious, so urgent. Okay, now, so let's just remind ourselves what the social protection floor is. It's basically a nationally defined set of social security guarantees that ensure your life cycle minimal requirements, essential healthcare, basic income security, which means that you have to include essential healthcare, including maternity care. basic income security for children. That means including access to nutrition, education, other care, and all the other necessary goods and services, minimal housing conditions, and so on. Basic income security for those who cannot earn a sufficient income, even if you're in the right age, like for sickness or unemployment or maternity or disability. And obviously, universal pensions, basic income security for older persons. But remember that social protection is only one aspect of broader social policies. And here I want to hark back to Tandika's immense contribution in this area, because he always emphasized that social policy is actually economic policy. It's wrong to see it as some separate strand. And it is absolutely critical in developing countries because it can enable and manage transitions. And development inevitably creates and involves transitions that can become very socially destabilizing, that can create conflict and winners and losers. So it is very important in managing these transitions by compensating losers. It can provide buffers to shocks and damage due to change. Now, I can add to that today, and I'm sure he would have also, that a lot of this change can also come from other shocks like climate change. And so you need the social protection to provide a buffer even to that, to enable societies to survive and thrive despite that. It obviously enhances domestic demand, and that is a huge concern today globally and macroeconomically, the inadequacy of demand. So clearly it plays an important economic role just in terms of ensuring that economies can continue to expand in ways that affect the well-being of people. It can alter income distribution in more progressive directions. It can assist industrialization and the shift to higher value added activities, especially social policies like education, which are critical in that shift towards higher value added activity promotion. But we also now know that if you don't have adequate social policy, it's a real handicap when you're facing crises like the pandemic. We saw that countries that didn't have adequate social policy really suffered, and their population is still suffering massively. Much, much more so than countries that had stronger, more resilient, and more widespread healthcare systems that were publicly managed, and countries that had sufficient social policy to manage the livelihood shocks that occurred during the pandemic. But remember, the pandemic is just the starter. Unfortunately, it's the appetizer course, and the main course of climate change is already upon us. It's already happening. And so the impact of inadequate social policy is going to become even more evident because of climate-induced crises. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned, developing countries have been wary of proactive social policy because of both actual fiscal constraints and self-imposed constraints. But if you have sufficient political will, you can deal with this. And if you have governments who say that, well, we will put restrictions on capital mobility so that we don't get these massive movements out, or we don't get threatened by credit rating agencies whenever we go in for an expansionary fiscal policy or whenever we go in for progressive taxation, then you can actually deal with all of these fears, these actual and imputed fears. And essentially, what I've been arguing is that progressive social policy is not just critical for all the reasons that Tandika had emphasized, but it's an important element out of the way in which we can get out of these multiple crises facing humanity. In other words, we are now faced with, let's face it, existential crises. And of course, we have to deal with them on multiple fronts, but we cannot deal with them unless we also associate them with the progressive social policy and with much more proactive and aggressive social policies. Okay, thank you. And I will stop the screen share right now. There we go.
Thank you, Professor Jayati Ghosh, and welcome for joining us at this time and with our time zones where you are and where we are in the continent. And thank you very much for your enlightening and pertinent talk with regards to how do we maneuver social policy and economic policy at these times of the pandemic. I notice we have one comment or question that's up here on the question comment side. If you can see that, It's more about what's your thoughts around how would you explain at this time of the pandemic the extreme need and broadened public spending in the rich world that African and other impoverished countries have not yet resisted austerity and other neoliberal policies insisted upon by the IMF? If there is a need, or if the need is for foreign exchange, why have these countries, African countries, not insisted on delaying debt servicing? Would you like to touch base on this aspect around how do we deal with the IMF and our austerities in Africa?
You know, this is a very interesting question. And so thank you, Salima, for that. It's a very important question, which I would like to take at two levels. I think, you know, it's true that in Africa, for sure, debt servicing is a major concern. And it's one of the issues that is very hard to tackle on your own. I think the experience of Argentina shows us how hard it is to deal as an individual debtor with either the IMF or this cartel of creditors. And something that we have been observing now for decades and yet still not doing anything about is the fact that creditors form a cartel and then they get, shall we say, represented by the IMF, but debtors do not. And there is such a sort of, resistance, certainly on the part of the creditors, but even among debtor countries to form cartels, which seems to be the obvious way out of this. Right now, we are faced with a situation where at least 72 countries have debts that are frankly unpayable, will never be repaid. And yet each of them submits and succumbs to pressure that makes them pay more or kick the can down the road while that can gets larger and larger. Whereas if in fact you could get some kind of a coming together of debtor countries that would force a change in the negotiating stance of the creditors, then we possibly would get action. So I think one of the ways in which debtor countries can address this is by working together, by collaborating, cooperating. Certainly African debt, I mean, there's a lot more regional cooperation now in Africa than there was before the pandemic, whether in industrial policy or pharmaceutical and drug production and vaccine production and so on. So I think it's about time that African countries for sure, and debtor countries in general, started thinking about a debtor cartel, if you like, or at least joint negotiations with creditors. But the second part of it, I believe, is something which is more problematic and difficult to address. And that's because it covers not just the debtor countries, it covers countries like my own, India, or Mexico and others, where the neoliberal fiscal austerity mindset has entered into the heads of policymakers and governments. So now we don't need the IMF to tell us. We are busy telling ourselves that you cannot spend more under any conditions, that you cannot, even when it will help your growth prospects, you have to always keep your deficit down to a certain level and you cannot do progressive taxation and so on. It's that liberal mindset which we have to fight much more effectively. This is not just, it hasn't happened by accident. It hasn't happened on its own. It's happened through decades of assiduous training of bureaucrats, assiduous, shifting of the minds of politicians, so that it's now taken for granted that you have to accept fiscal austerity. And it's quite interesting how global capital, which has suddenly accepted, no austerity in the advanced countries, all of the nonsense that we used to hear about deficit limits, etc., has suddenly disappeared in the advanced countries, right? They can spend 15 to 30% of GDP, as I have mentioned. That same approach, global capital doesn't really care about in the developing world because it's not as important for their own survival. And so they are content to let the developing world rest in this mire of self-imposed fiscal austerity, even for the countries where it's not necessary, as I mentioned. We are doing this to ourselves. That requires a much more concerted effort, I believe, at not just awareness, but political mobilization. And it's a tough job, but I think we have to do this. We have to do the political mobilization to expose that lie and enable our own governments to spend more as required. For that, in turn, we have to insist on much greater control over capital flows. because otherwise global capital, global finance will ensure that any attempt at fiscal expansion will result in a major capital outflow and a financial and banking and balance of payments crisis.
Thank you, Prof. Ghosh. We have two more questions that are coming up, and I would like also Professor Jimmy to get ready to look at what the SACCI chair and what Prof. Ghosh has highlighted with regards to social policy and economics. Can we have a question I see from Nimi Hoffman? Nimi wants to know about the barriers to collective action in terms of forming a debtors cartel to resist the IMG, or forming a natural resources cartel to deal with volatility in commodities prices, or a taxation cartel. I like the use of the word cartel, Nimi, to deal with illicit financial flows. How do countries overcome these barriers? Quite an interesting one from Nimi.
Yeah, very interesting question, Nimi, and I think very pertinent. I think all the aspects that you raised are absolutely pertinent and correct. So, it's not, yes, cartel, okay, we can call it a cartel. Of course, that will raise hackles everywhere. Let's call whatever we call it, a joint negotiating group, anything. We can call it any of these things. But yes, we absolutely must have them in all of these. In other words, we have to bring back developing countries cooperating and working together. Every G7 does it, right? Employers do it, capitalists do it. They get together, they gang up, and then they get it to everybody else. And then the rest of us are sitting there saying, oh, you shouldn't gang up. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is real politics. This is the world we're in. So we have to learn how to confront that with our own bargaining strength. And we will never have bargaining strength individually. We will have to get together. So I completely agree with you. Mining rights, royalties, right? I mean, if all of us, or if more of us, withdrew from the absolutely terrible ISDS arrangements and the terrible the tribunals that do that, they would be without power. They would be powerless. So we need to get together and say we're all withdrawing. 25 countries are going to withdraw. 30 countries are going to withdraw. It changes the whole perspective and the landscape. Mining is going to become even more important here. And I think it's very important to mention all this greening that is happening in the developed world. Okay, all the massive reduction in carbon emissions is happening largely in two ways. One, by exporting the emissions, relying much more on imported emissions in the developing countries, but also by shifting towards green energy sources, particularly in the form of electrification, right? Now, a lot of that requires mining and minerals and rare earths that are found in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia. And so we're going to see another mad scramble for a lot of these resources, lithium, copper for sure, but, coltan and a bunch of other rare earths, which are critical for solar batteries, for electric cars, and so on and so forth. We have to be prepared for this and not allow us once again to be exploited by rapacious extractive industries from the north that are going to come and grab what they can. We should be setting conditions, demanding public control over those resources, demanding adequate shared royalties, just distribution of the gains from these, instead of once again being just taken for a ride. So I think it's very important to join together in all of these things. Taxation, again, the OECD tax process, the base erosion and profit shifting inclusive process, as it was called, was anything but inclusive. It was a deal decided on by G7, forced onto G20, and then imposed on all of the 136 member countries. We have to fight that by saying, well, okay, we don't like your deal, we're doing our own. If enough developing countries get together and say, we are going to impose on multinationals a tax based on our perception of our fair share of their profits. If enough of us get together, we are strong. The trouble is we're all individual and we say, oh, we can't do anything and how can we influence them? So instead of hoping that they will suddenly be nice to us, we should start bargaining based from a position of greater strength, which can only happen if we combine. So yes, I completely take all your points on this.
Thank you for that one. There's another one from Dennis Canterbury. Dennis comments you on the lecture, but he wants to know on what do you make of the current realignment in economic policy with Asia as a way out of the problems you have outlined in your keynote address?
You know, once again, I'm reminded of Tandika and something he said to me, which has really remained in my mind. We were talking about recent Chinese and Indian investment. This is some time ago, but you know, at that time, recent Chinese and Indian investment in different parts of Africa, and the critique in many African countries that, you know, they were being extractive and they were being colonial in the approach. And of course, this is something that is planted by Western powers also, right? Because they wanted to be the only colonials. And Tandika's response was that, yes, sure, you know, they are interested in their own national interests and interested in extraction and so on and so forth. But it's always better to have competing imperialists, because you can actually play off one against the other. You can bargain for better terms. In fact, it's never good to be subject to only one imperial power, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. So I think that the realignment with China in particular, it's really China, because India's role is very minor, is something that Africans have to see in terms of their own interests and what they can gain from and benefit from. I think it's worth noting that, you know, the Chinese role has been very significant, not only in terms of certain types of infrastructure, but in changing the discourse of the Western aid agencies. You know, they had all moved away from providing infrastructure towards the soft stuff and getting people to do lots more microfinance and, you know, whatever was the flavor of the month in poverty reduction, cash transfer, whatever it is. When the Chinese come and say, we're going to invest huge amounts in Angola or in Mozambique or in this or in that, suddenly you find the Western aid agencies also saying, okay, now we're also going to invest in infrastructure. We're also going to invest in roads and so on and so forth. So it has created a shift, but a lot depends on how African governments themselves respond. Where the Chinese investments have been the most advantageous is where the governments themselves have sought to ensure that they are compatible with their own national development goals. And I think there's more and more research that shows that, including some done by some of my own research students, that it really depends on how the governments respond in terms of that shift. There is no one inevitable outcome. It will depend critically on the domestic political economy and that interplay with the Chinese interests or Asian interests more broadly.
Thank you for that one. We have Mugisha. I think you can have a sip of water there, Prof Ghosh, whilst I'm highlighting the question from Mugisha. Mugisha says, if you can share more light on the conception of social policy as economic policy, and that was highlighted because of what Professor Tandika believed in. What could be gained and lost through this conception, given the tendency for economics not to speak adequately to issues of care compared, say, to profit? Interesting one from Mugisha.
Yeah, that's right. That's a very interesting question. So, you know, I want to come back to this question about, and I think this is linking to some of the other questions. I noticed that I think Kate Meager has a question which is related about, you know, whether this focus on the sort of demand impact of social policy is playing into the hands of those who see this as another means for just, you know, prolonging and extending capitalism and so on. So I think we have to basically think of social policy as economic policy by also rethinking our notion of what economic policy should be doing. And here I want to bring in something which might seem extraneous, but I don't think it is. I happen to be a member of a WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All. And our starting point, this is a council headed by Mariana Mazzucato. And incidentally, it's all women, but that's, I would say it's incidental. But the point is that the focus of our council is quite different from the standard way in which economists look at aspects of the social, if you like, which is to say that our aim is health for all. Okay, that's what we want to achieve. And then we're saying, what is the economy that will deliver health for all? What are the parts of the economy that we need to consider, and how do we manage, regulate, and deal with all of those parts to ensure health for all? Which means you would look at, for example, innovation policy and technology in terms of how it's delivering health for all. And we will say that the current way of managing innovation is all wrong, because it is allowing private monopolies over knowledge, which prevent health for all. So we have to think of a new way of managing innovation, a different way of regulating, and a different way of doing the so-called public-private partnerships, which doesn't mean that the public takes on the risks and the private gets all the profits and gets to keep the knowledge. Similarly, we're looking at financing. We're saying, well, all right, we want health for all. Which are the ways in which we finance that? And once again, obviously public finance is essential for that. But if there's private finance, how do you manage it? How do you regulate it to ensure that it's not just about generating private profits, but health for all? In other words, the goal is health for all. So we're looking at the economy in terms of that. And so on and so forth. I could give you many more examples, but the point is this. The point is that we shouldn't be thinking of social policy. I mean, what's the point of an economy? What's the point of economic arrangements? Why do we have a market and so on? Finally, because we want a happy, healthy, productive society that enables people to fulfill their potential, right? And have the freedoms, the capabilities that Seth talked about. That's why we want an economy to function in a particular way. Now, one way of doing it is to say, well, here's this neoliberal economy. It will eventually deliver through trickle down and whatever. Another way of doing it is to say, well, look, the economy we have is not delivering this. It's giving us inequality, oppression, exploitation, and unsustainability, right? We're going to destroy the planet as well. So now let's think of which economy, what do we need to change in that economy to give us that? When you think about it that way, economic policy, social policy, they're the same, really. This whole idea that social policy is a little thing on the side you do for the welfare of the citizenry, that's completely demolished. Everything we do is directed towards a happier, freer, productive society, in which case the economic policies have to be, and the institutions and the regulatory practices need to be adjusted for that. Now, that's, if you like, the ideal. Clearly, there is power involved. And of course, one of the critical things all of us would recognize about the economy is that always it reflects power imbalances, distributive calls, and issues of bargaining power. So we have to factor all of that into account. We have to say, well, all right, this is the kind of thing we want in terms of our economy, which includes things that are often called social policy. And we want to think of ways in which we can counter the existing power imbalances, using economic policies, using economic institutions, and using regulatory practices and legal codes, because all of them matter critically. So we recognize the power imbalances, we recognize the bargaining imbalances, and then we say, well, all right, what are we going to do in terms of the changes in economic policy that can do this? And of course, if you say health for all, somebody will say, oh, that's a social policy. But for us, in fact, everything that we do is really about the economic policy. So the two, it's very different then to distinguish between them. Think of it the other way. If you think of health for all and say, well, that's a social policy and whatever you're doing for health, it's nice to have healthy people. But, it makes no sense to talk about an economy without recognizing that the health of the people who are functioning in that economy is absolutely critical. And so I could say the same thing for education, that, many people talk about how the education levels of people are important for the economy. And then there are all these estimates, right, of how this much. And of course, there's the other thing that frankly always drives me crazy, when they talk about women and they say, oh, if you had more women working, the GDP would go up by that much. To me, it's completely the wrong-headed way of looking at it. What we should be interested in is what's the best society in which women also have the freedom to work when they want and don't have to do unpaid work, disproportionately compared to others, and that society recognizes unpaid work, reduces it, redistributes it, rewards the care workers who do it, and so on and so forth. If you do all of that, then you stop thinking of social policy as this side deal that you have to somehow justify by saying that it will lead to this much economic growth. You're saying that our purpose is this human progress. Some economic policies impede it. Some social policies are absolutely necessary for it. We are going to look at that combination of policies which delivers the human progress that we want. I think that is the way I would look at it.
Thank you for that analysis, Prof. And I think you have covered aspects from Kate Miga's questions and also Tekwa when you were answering Mugisha's question, because they are interrelated. There's one more here that I want you to touch base on. It's from Laura Mann. And Laura said, is there an equivalent of Codesria in South Asia? How has the political context for critical social science changed within your region in South Asia? And how might the intellectual networks around transformative social policy be strengthened across regions? What's your take on this one, Prof?
Oh, wow. How I wish we had an equivalent of Codesria or Claxo in Latin America. In fact, we've been trying in Asia. It's very, very difficult, unfortunately. I have been involved in an attempt to do sort of a South-driven thing, ideas. Some of you are, in fact, members of it, International Development Economics Associates. And the idea comes from, we have collaborated with Codesria and Claxo as well in the past. And I really wish we could generate something like this for Asia, but it is very difficult, not only because of a greater hold of neoliberalism in many of our countries, but because of, let's face it, the changing political terrain, which has made it harder and harder for progressive non-governmental organizations and groups to function at all, much less to get together with others. So I hope that there will be a time when we can get the equivalent of a Codesria in Asia. I can tell you we sorely need it. And I hope that we can, in fact, talk about that as a way of propelling a lot of our economies forward in different ways. It's not helped by the fact that, Asia is so huge and so disparate. And there are many different levels of development in Asia. With some OECD countries, some very high per capita income countries, one major emerging power, and a bunch of some very, very least developed countries as well. And it's so lumping it together as one region is always difficult, but I think it's also been made a bit worse by the thing I mentioned earlier, this sort of penetration of neoliberal economics into the minds of policymakers and therefore also of economic researchers.
Interesting. We have 1 minute to go. Anyone with a burning question or comment for Professor Ghosh? A great presentation and sharing her ideas and perspectives on social policy and economics. Professor Adesina, I see Professor Vusi Gumede here. Do you have any thoughts, comments you want to put forward before we close the session?
No, thank you. I think, we couldn't have done it better than Jayati. Always a delight, always a delight. We'll just be going into the break preparatory to the first plenary session. Thank you.
Thank you all for letting me join you.
And thank you very much for taking your time out in the early hours of your time zones that side. And I think the comments and deliberations that were put forward will also assist you in your projects and in the committees that you serve to ensure that, like you indicated, that that question on Asia, whether you have a Codesria or Glasgow, maybe it's another food for thought that, like you said, that it's another important thing. And I think next time when the conference meet, you might have something under your wings to say, this is what has come up, because I assume that it's one thing that might be of a good move to have that happen in Asia. So thank you very much, colleagues, and your comments were noted, and we appreciate all our keynote welcoming addresses and also the keynote presentation from Professor Ghosh. We really value that. And I assume, Professor Adesina, that we will have the presentations on the CODESIA website. And thank you very much. We can now break for tea for 30 minutes. Then we go to our respective panels. Professor Jimmy Adesina, any other further thing there from your side?
Just to say that the next panel starts in 30 minutes time. So people can have a comfort break of 30 minutes. And, we'll start the first plenary session at 11:15 Central African time. It's in 30 minutes time.
Thank you very much. And colleagues, you are welcome to connect with Professor Jayati Ghosh, because I see there are lots of comments and commendations from her. You can connect with her online via email to take your comments further with her and your research projects. And thank you very much. We'll see you then at 11:30 SAT time. Thank you, Prof Ghosh. Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues.
Bye.